The Eritrean Railway is the only railway system in Eritrea. It was constructed between 1887 and 1932 by the Kingdom of Italy for the Italian Eritrea colony and connected the port of Massawa with Bishir near the Sudan border. The line was destroyed by warfare in subsequent decades but has been rebuilt between Massawa and Asmara. Vintage equipment is still used on the line. Characteristics: the railway was built by the Italians in order to connect Massawa and Asmara, the main cities of Italian Eritrea. In the 1930s, Italian leader Benito Mussolini wanted to reach Kassala in Sudan, but his war to conquer Ethiopia and create the Italian Empire stopped the enlargement to Agordat and Bishir. After damage suffered by the railway during World War II, the section between Massawa and Asmara was dismantled partially and was only rebuilt in the 1990s by the Eritrean authorities. The railway is narrow gauge and is being rebuilt after the devastation wreaked upon it by the War of Independence. Its newest equipment is over 50 years old, with most of it predating World War II. It is one of the few railway systems still in existence using equipment like the 1930s Italian-built Litorina railcars behind 1930s vintage mallet steam locomotives. 950 mm gauge. Eritrea was an Italian colony, and accordingly its railway was built by Italian engineers to Italian standards, using equipment bought from Italy. The gauge chosen was the Italian standard narrow gauge measurement of 950 mm, similar to many common narrow gauge railways under construction in Italy at the same time, with a short building time and the simultaneous flow of some common equipment and materials to the national railway yards, e.g., metallic plate ties. It was necessary to acquire these from France to some extent. A previous Italian law from 1879 officially established the track gauges, which specified the use of 1,500 mm and 1,000 mm gauge truck measured from the center of the rails, or 1,445 mm and 950 mm, respectively, on the inside faces. Construction began from the Red Seaport city of Massawa in 1887, heading towards the capital city of Asmara. The Dekoval Railway was the first built, from Massawa to Sati, just 27 kilometers. Progress was slow, thanks to the long climb up the mountains to the high plateau of inland Eritrea, and the substantial civil engineering works required. The line reached Asmara in 1911. It was extended to Keren in 1922, Agat in 1925, Agordat in 1928, and finally Bishir in 1932, for a total length of 280 kilometers. Bishir proved to be the end, even though the builders had ambitions of reaching the Sudan Railways line. Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia led to resources being diverted elsewhere, including the upgrading of the line from Massawa to Asmara to handle more traffic. Building the line from Massawa to Asmara was a significant undertaking. Even with the tighter turns and narrower right-of-way allowed by a narrow-gauge railway, the line required 65 bridges and 39 tunnels, the longest being 320 meters. Even so, there were still grades of more than 3%. The highest point on the railway is just east of Asmara, 2,394 meters above sea level. The construction of the railway was considered a fine achievement of the first half of the 20th century. In operation, in 1935 it carried supplies for the Italian war effort in Ethiopia, and the line saw 30 trains daily, while by 1965 the line was carrying nearly 500,000 passengers a year as well as 200,000 tons of freight. Things went downhill from there. Improvements to the road from Massawa to Asmara, and to the trucks and buses that used it, began to take traffic away from the railway. Until 1941, the railway was Italian-controlled, but the fortunes of war allowed the British to take control. After 1942, the railway was abandoned from Agordat to Bishia. In 1942, the British moved some diesel locomotives and materials to Eritrea when they dismantled the railway Mogadiscio-Villabruzzi of Italian Somalia. In 1944, the British dismantled the Italian-built Asmara-Massawa cableway that supplemented the railway as a means of transportation inland. The cableway equipment was sent south to Britain's colony Kenya. In 1953, Eritrea was joined to Ethiopia in federation as the British pulled out, giving Ethiopia a coastline, but starting off 40 years of unrest and eventually war. The 1950s and 1960s were successful years for the railway, but in the 1970s the railway fell more and more out of use as the unrest intensified, and in 1975 the railway was destroyed by the ruling Derg regime in Ethiopia. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed during the following years of war, and both sides used materials salvaged from the railway for fortification and other purposes. Rebuilding. Eritrea won its independence from Ethiopia in 1993, and in 1994 the Eritrean president declared that rebuilding the railway was a priority for the new nation. During the war years, a spirit of self-reliance had been built up, and the Eritreans refused foreign loans and expensive rework. Instead, the Eritreans decided they would rebuild what they had left with their own efforts. Rebuilding the line started, some work going into rebuilding the workshops and station in Asmara, while others set to reconstructing the Massawa end. Renovation of the main line began from Massawa westbound, recovering rails and steel ties. At the same time, restoration began on the remaining locomotives and rolling stock remaining after the conflict. 11 steam locomotives survived, and at least 6 have been rebuilt to working order. In addition, several 1930s vintage Fiat Literina railcars survive and have been made operational, as well as 2 1957 Krupp-built Bobo diesels and one of 3 surviving Drurish Hunters, brought to the railway by the British during the war years. Finally, several road trucks have been converted to run on rail wheels. Much freight stock and a number of passenger cars also survive. The line has been restored from Massawa to Asmara, but as of 2006 no scheduled services traverse the whole length of the line. Charter trains for tourists now do, and regular train services exist in certain areas, while the surviving equipment is sufficient for such a limited service. The purchase or building of more is necessary to provide a serious form of transportation over the length of the line. The Eritrean Railroad Authority has requested funding to continue the Italian-era plan to extend the route to Tessani and provide an opportunity for Sudan to efficiently use the port of Massawa. Mining companies in Eritrea have also inquired about use of the railway and its improvement. The surviving freight cars include a number of larger box cars suitable for a limited freight service. Equipment. Steam locomotives. 3 classes of steam locomotives still exist. 1 design of 04 Oshunter and 2 designs of 044 Malad for line service. 202 series. These small 04 tank engines were one of the standard shunter locomotives of the system, built between between 1927 and 1937 by the firm of Breda in Milan. They have short-side tanks, a rear coal bunker, and a unified oval dome containing the steam dome inside a larger sound dome. This arrangement, popular worldwide in nations that favored the sound dome, helped both to insulate the steam dome and to keep the sound dry with the warmth. Large prominent builders' plates adorn the domes. They utilize wall-shaped valve gear with piston valves and superheating, and are painted in the traditional European style of red below the running board, including frames and wheels, and black above, including boiler, cab, tanks, etc. The purpose of the red paint is to make cracks and breakages in the locomotive's important running gear more obvious. 6 of these engines survive, of which 2 are in running order and 4 in storage awaiting restoration. 440 series. One of these early mallet locomotives, which is a true mallet and thus a compound, still exists in storage at the Asmara workshops. It was a 1915 product of Ansaldo in Geneva. 442 series. These later, and much larger, compound mallet locomotives were built by Ansaldo in Geneva in 1938 to largely replace the earlier types, both the 440 series and the unsuccessful 441 series. The latter were simple locomotives and found liable to run out of steam on the heavy grades of the line. 4 of them are still in existence, of which 3 are in running order. These are the prime mainline steam locomotives of the railway and are in high demand for tourist services. 2 of them, double-headed, are required to scale the steepest grades with a train of any length. Like the other locomotives, they are tank engines with large side tanks and a rear coal bunker under cover of the cab roof in this design. Diesel locomotives. The railway possesses 5 diesel locomotives. They are in the process of being returned to working order. Krupp Bobo road switches. The railway purchased 2 Krupp-built Bobo 25D road switches of typical German offset cab design in 1957. The newest motive power owned by the system and the only locomotives purchased after World War II. They are both still in working order. When the line's replacement is complete, it is intended to use them for hauling freight. The road switches are painted in a creamy white with brown frames and trucks. Drury shunters. 3 Drury Carco built diesel shunters are owned by the railway, and were brought to Eritrea by the British after the takeover in 1941. They were previously in service in the Sudan and were of a slightly wider gauge. There, they were re-gauged to the railway's 950 mm gauge by turning them from an outside frame to an inside framed layout. 2 are 06 OS and 1 is and 04 one of each is working while the third is under repair. They are painted in the same scheme as the Krupp units but lacking the bonnet sides and the engines are exposed. Railcars. 3 Fiat-built Litourina railcars survived the Civil War and 2 are in working order. They are Art Deco in style with large Fiat radiators on the front. The bodies are painted in creamy white with grey underneath and roofs with red bumpers on the ends and a red stripe separating the body color from the grey below. They are intended for tourist service. New vehicles will be built or bought for regular passenger service. In addition, 1 4-wheel railcar built by Brown Boveri of Switzerland exists out of service in the Asmara shops. It was apparently being used as a mobile generator car before the Civil War. It was originally built for Italian Somaliland Railway. For maintenance, an improvised maintenance car is used, a 4-wheeler built from a motorcycle. Rail trucks. A number of Russian-built Orion light trucks have been converted to run on rail wheels. At present, they are being used in the railway's reconstruction. passenger cars. A number of passenger cars, all mounted on two four-wheel trucks, survive. They are fitted with wooden seats and have a platform at each end, one of which is for the brakeman. There are no continuous train brakes on the railway, and braking is either done with the locomotive's brakes or by manually applying the brakes on each car. They are now painted in an attractive livery of white with pale blue in a stripe above the windows and at the bottom of the bodywork. Freight cars, abandoned goods wagons sit on sidings near Asmara and are being restored. Priority is being given to the 8-wheel box cars and flat cars, but a large number of 4-wheel cars still exist. Couplings and brakes. Locos and wagons are equipped with a single center buffer with a hook and screw chain underneath. There are no continuous brakes. Instead, a brakeman travels on each coach to apply braking when required. However, a picture of a tank car shows hoses for some kind of continuous brake. Loading gauge. The structural gauge of the Eritrean Railway is small. Therefore, two test runs, one in 2006, another one in spring 2010, took place when ISO containers were carried on traditional flat wagons through all the tunnels along the line. In December 2010, two ISO containers of Maersk Line with equipment donated by the Danish State Railway for the rail workshops in Asmara traveled all the line with no problems. It is not clear if the containers were 8 feet 0 in high or 9 feet 6 in high. Route. The railway was fully opened in 1932. It ran from the port of Massawa westwards to Asmara, then extending northwards to Karin, Agordat and Bishia. It was partially built from Bishia to Tessani at the beginning of World War II, but this section was not finished when the British conquered Eritrea in 1941. Until 1978, even the route Asmara-Karin remained partially active. As of 2009, the 118 km section between Massawa and Asmara is open. Mersa-Fatuma-Kaluli Transport Railway and Asmara-Massawa Cableway. The Eritrean Railway was complemented by the Asmara-Massawa Cableway, and by a small transport railway between Mersa-Matuma and Kaluli, nearly 90 kilometers south of Massawa. Cableway. The cableway was built by Italy in the 1930s, and connected the port of Massawa with the city of Asmara. The cableway was the longest of its kind in the world at the time of its inauguration. It had 13 stations with diesel engines, with 16 20-little transport wagons. The British later dismantled it during their 11-year occupation, after defeating Italy in World War II. Potash Transport Railway. A 42 km long 600 mm gauge potash transport railway built to serve the locations Ada Ito and Bada, located between Massawa and Asab. A 600 mm gauge line was built in 1905 by the Italians inside the port of Mersa-Fatuma and from it into the hinterland until Kaluli near the Ethiopian border. Potash production is said to have reached about 50,000 metric tons after this railway was constructed. Production was stopped some years after World War I owing to large-scale supplies mainly from Germany. Unsuccessful attempts to reopen successful production were made in the period 1920 to 1941 by the Italian government. Between the years 1925 to 29, an Italian company mined 25,000 tons of sylvite, averaging 70% potassium chloride, which was transported by rail to Mersa-Fatuma. This was the main source of potash in Eritrea and had to cease most operations because of the Great Depression of 1929.